There was nothing better in the 2000s than getting home from school, popping in Hybrid Theory, and then just playing PS2 all day while you're listening to Chester. Like, that was a vibe. That was a whole thing. Reflecting back on like the early 2000s, back when I was a chubby middle schooler, there was a lot of new metal.
Cut my life into pieces. This is my last resort.
To me, it feels like there's been a change in aesthetic, in at least sadness, in the last 25 years. I think there is something easier to palate about vulnerability that is pretty. In the 2000s, it felt like sadness was almost something to be purged through. Anger and new metal and sadness and angry kids and dysfunction, they all kind of went together. Like, we went to these hardcore shows and moshed and became these testosterone-ridden rage machines just for the sake of getting sadness out. I think for a kid that grew up in a household that was unpredictable and somewhat violent, for me, it was a little too angry. But at the time, it felt like somewhere that I fit. So I would go to these hardcore shows when I was like a freshman in high school after my new metal phase, and I would go see Poison the Well or The Locust or Dillinger Escape Plan, and I'd go in the pit for like 30 seconds and then get scared. And it honestly felt like a community to me of people who all connected over music that was inherently just sad. I feel like we seen sadness start to become a little more commercialized. Not that it wasn't commercialized during new metal, but I think unfortunately with the monetization of just aesthetics in general, you start to wonder if the new metal in the 2000s was genuine, or they just knew they were going to get a bunch of money from 12-year-olds that went to Hot Topic. I think with the rise of the internet, we are a little oversaturated with choices in sad music, but I do have to say in the 2000s, there wasn't as many choices for things to listen to if you weren't feeling that great. We listened to a lot of Saddle Creek. We listened to a lot of Bright Eyes, Cursive, stuff like that. For us, I think would have been called sad boy aesthetic now. But for us back then, it was just guys wearing girls' jeans. You know, we all dressed up very similar. We all wore those tight girls' jeans and youth large t-shirts and just looked insane. I think we looked crazy. I think during the late 2000s when we were seeing music like Bright Eyes, what's that album with Something Vague on it by Bright Eyes? Fevers and Mirrors and Arcade Fire and Elliott Smith kind of come into the more mainstream. We were starting to embrace a more niche version of sadness. And I think the counterculture to that is almost the 2010s after the 2008 financial crisis. The stripped down music of the 2000s gave way to a bigger instrumentation in the 2010s, where we seen bands like Of Monsters and Men and the Lumineers putting out these large instrumentations over pretty much single acoustic guitar melodies. And they used a lot of them in car commercials. I think we had a lot of undeserved optimism in the 2010s, and I think you can see that a lot in music like Mumford and Sons. I think as a society, we were a little less focused on what the government was doing to us post 9/11 and how life felt. During the 2010s, those same stripped down folk style guitars became these big, huge instrumentations with horns and organs. I think much like Alex Warren and a lot of those artists now, like Benson Boone, that tend to get criticism for not being authentic. People kind of felt that way about like the Lumineers and stuff like that, but it didn't stop car commercials from picking those songs up. I think over the course of the 2010s, this music almost became a meme, and it didn't really reflect what the outside world looked like. So I think it was hard for people to buy into something that felt so inauthentic, especially in a world that didn't feel positive at all. I think as the 2020s kind of started, we seen a lot more introspection and reflection in especially COVID, and artists like Phoebe Bridgers or Ethel Cain, Mitski got really popular, being very vulnerable. If you listen to Korn and then listen to Phoebe Bridgers, I'm sure it's going to be kind of a shock. But I think the only difference in the music, besides the presentation, is how the vulnerability is presented. I think what we're seeing now after the post 2010s, post COVID era of music is vulnerability that's pretty impalatable, but also some of the best music I've listened to in my life. I think in the 2000s, people were really confused. I think they were very angry, and I think sadness came out in a lot of more grounded ways. I think as a society now, we tend to find disassociation and quiet to be more healing to us than something that's rage filled or loud. I think a lot of bands that were louder in that era of like the 2010s have kind of quieted down. Like Paramore is a good example. Like their music has matured with how society almost feels now. And to me, I think that's a mark of a good band. The 2000s felt like anger was your only control over sadness. The 2025s feel like you have no control over anything but your sadness. Now it almost feels like we want to disconnect from that reality. To me, the aesthetic of sadness went from anger to vulnerability with anger to strange optimism to disassociation. Not sure. I'm not sure what that means for sadness in the future, but that's what it feels like right now. But like everything, I think music goes in waves. We saw big instrumentation in the 2000s, and then we seen that instrumentation stripped down quite a bit later in the 2000s. And then in the 2010s, we had these giant, huge instrumentals with horns and organs and stomps and claps. And I think that's given way to a sound now that is more stripped down and vulnerable than ever. It's almost like a world that has accepted that it has no control and has decided to disassociate instead.